So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be back here once again. A lot longer interval than I expected, due to COVID, of course. And today, I think that the title of the talk is like Lessons for Life. But I think that I would prefer to talk about areas of life which I would like to encourage you to think about and to reflect upon. So rather than me saying this is a lesson you need to learn, I may share with you some of the things that I've learned, or certainly areas of life which I've found it very useful, productive to investigate at some length, with some depth, and I hope that we'll be able to share some ideas with you that you will find will be of some benefit to you also. So I'd like to begin, I think, with talking about friendship. And Theravada Buddhism, this school of Buddhism, which we find in Thailand, is one which tends to put a lot of emphasis on personal effort. And one of the key themes is that we will really understand the nature of things. We will find true wisdom in our lives through our own personal efforts. It's not a matter of simply being in the presence of wise, noble beings that somehow that we would absorb that wisdom and peace as if by osmosis. We have to make the effort ourselves. So this is a teaching of effort. But this teaching of effort is balanced by an emphasis on the creation of healthy communities which are inspired by the idea of friendship and the ideal of developing oneself in a way that we can see ourselves as good friends to those around us. And at the same time, developing the ability to choose our friends. Of course, in a school like this, then there are certain advantages for being put in a position where we can't choose our friends, and learning the skills to rub along and to live in harmony with people who we would otherwise perhaps not choose to spend time with. But after leaving school, when you go to university, if that's your choice, then choice of friends is a very important thing to give attention to. And so we need some criteria. What makes a good friend? And to what extent do we consider ourselves good friends to those around us? And what are the qualities in those people that we want to spend time with, spend our lives with in future? In developing relationships, romantic relationships as well, we hear a lot about love, and a lot of great claims are made for the power of love and the meaning of a life filled with love. But I would suggest that if you look at people who've made long and successful marriages, that friendship between the husband and wife or between the two partners is every bit as important, or in some cases more important. People who love each other have disastrous relationships at times, but people who are good friends to each other rarely do so. So this is the first area of life. I'm not going to sermonize on it very much, but because we have limited time, but I'm suggesting that this is well worth your time. In the Buddhist tradition, in this Buddhist tradition, there is no concept of a guru. The spiritual teacher is called the good friend. So this gives you an idea of how important, how central the idea of friendship is. The Buddha is the ultimate good friend. The spiritual teacher is a good friend. And on the level of the spiritual teacher, there are certain qualities that we can recognize in a good friend. And those are the good friend, the teacher, is one who inspires affection, inspires respect, inspires emulation. The good friend is one who is patient, one who is a good communicator, one who understands people and how to relate to people in the kindest and wisest way. And a good friend, particularly one who is in a position of authority, never uses his authority or prestige or power in any way to the detriment of the friend or the student. Never abuses his power in any way or her power in any way. So that's the most elevated example of the friend in the Buddhist tradition. Of course, in family life and in school life, university life, be somewhat different. But the area of life in which we are living with others and the principles upon which we establish relationships is given great importance in Buddhism. The teachings of the Buddha, you may have heard the word Dhamma, or Dhamma, but that is not the entirety of the Buddha's teachings. The Buddha himself referred to his teachings as the Dhamma Vinaya. And the Vinaya refers to all of the agreements and conventions and customs and rules that we establish in order to facilitate the most peaceful and harmonious kind of community, beginning with family. So the next area of life that I would like to suggest you give some thought to is, given that we all have blind spots, we all have weaknesses, we all have desires and fears, and we all are, to one level or another, subject to greed and anger and jealousy and so on and so forth. Given that human beings are like this, how can we live together in harmony? How can we reduce or minimize the impact of these kinds of negative mental states on the way that we relate to each other? So, the Buddhist answer, to give you some perspective on this, is that as human beings we have a certain special capacity. A special capacity here means that something that is unique to human beings, or something that we can see as in marked contrast to the animals, the animal life around us, the other forms of life. We are subject to the same instincts as all other living beings. The instinct for life, the instinct to procreate, and so on and so forth. We share these kinds of instincts with all beings. But as humans, we have a reflective ability, meaning that we can not follow our instincts on some occasions. Let's say we see something that we really like and we would really want to possess or to enjoy. But then we realize that it belongs to somebody else. And I think that most of us would say, well, therefore I won't take that thing, even if I could take it without anybody knowing that I did so. Why? Because it wouldn't be right, or that person would be very upset if something that was of meaning and value to them was to disappear or be stolen. So this is a very simple example, isn't it? That we have some desire, we have some instinctive pull towards something, and yet we decide not to follow it. So this is the building block of healthy families and communities. So as Buddhists, we take what we call the 5 precepts as a framework for living in community. For instance, we say, sometimes I still get very angry, I lose my temper, I feel very aggressive, even or especially with people that I love. I'm working on that, it's a work in progress. But in the meantime, I undertake not to express my anger and aggression in any way which is hurtful to the people around me, the beings around me. So that's not overly idealistic. It's difficult, but it's possible. And if you make that kind of undertaking publicly, announce it to all the people that you live with, what happens? They feel safe. And you create trust. So feelings of safety and trust are absolutely fundamental to a healthy family, a healthy society, aren't they? So this is a Buddhist idea. We make use of a basic capacity that we have in an intelligent way to minimize the impact of negative mental states as they are expressed through body and mind, out of respect for those around us, out of respect for ourselves. And we give the gift of safety, and we create trust in those around us. So the idea here is that voluntarily taking on boundaries for the way that you behave, the way that you speak, and being able to govern your actions and speech within the boundaries that you have voluntarily adopted is fundamental to human happiness and to the creation of the kinds of communities in which I think everyone would like to live. So this is an area of life which I think really repays some really concentrated kind of thought and reflection. How do we live together, given that we have different personalities, different desires, and that we have this, the untrained mind certainly is often irrational and often the prey of negative mental states. And how can we live together in a way that we can feel respect for ourselves, and a way in which we can feel friends with ourselves? Because this is a real problem these days. Very few people like their own company. Most people, when they are alone, find it very difficult, don't they? You may have seen this in yourself. The moment you're alone, you want to do something, or to watch something, or listen to something, or to have something going on. Something, anything, is better than nothing. This is the general way of looking at ourselves, I think, for most people. And so we can be very selfish, self-obsessed even, narcissistic, and yet the irony of it is that we behave sometimes in ways that we're not very proud of for our own welfare and well-being, and yet we don't really like ourselves. We don't really like to be with ourselves, and we run away from ourselves as much as we possibly can. So how can we be a good friend to ourselves? I'm talking already about friendship. How can you live your life in such a way that you like yourself? You like to be with yourself. You enjoy your own company. The Buddhism says, the teachings of the Buddha point to the quality of our actions and speech as being fundamental to that. And the other area of life is acting for the welfare of others without any wish for reward or recognition even. Giving, sharing. This is behavior which elevates the mind, brings joy into the mind, brings self-respect into the mind. When I first arrived in Thailand in the late 1970s, living in the countryside, and people in the villages were very poor, and yet they had a real sense of joy and self-respect that I found very beautiful, charming. And my analysis of their obvious happiness, given their material poverty, was that every morning, first thing in the morning, they wake up, cook some rice, and go out and stand outside their house, say good morning to their neighbors, and wait for the monks to arrive on alms round. And before going off to work in the fields, the first thing that they would do would be to offer rice to the monks. But in those days we very rarely got any curries or sweets or fruit, or it was mostly rice because that's all people had. But even the poorest people in the village, though they had no money in the bank, they didn't have bank accounts in those days, they had rice. And putting a little lump of sticky rice into the monk's bowl was affirming to themselves that they had something to offer, they had something to give, they were givers, and that they contributed just a little to the life of the monks and the life of the religion which they upheld. So this sense of oneself as a giver, as a sharer, as someone who, because they give, proves through that giving that they are somebody who has something to give to the world, even if it might be the most modest of gifts, like a small lump of sticky rice. So the area of life I would like to encourage you to reflect is what brings joy to life. One of these kind of questions which seems intelligent and meaningful but isn't really is, what is the meaning of life? As if there is a thing called life and a particular meaning of life. It's one of those false kind of questions. And more, I think, a better question is, what gives meaning to life? Or what gives meaning to your life? And giving, I would suggest, is one thing that really gives meaning and depth and something very powerful and abiding to us in our life. So if you can try this and experiment, if you recall an occasion on which you gave something to somebody without any hope, any expectation of reward or recognition. That even if a year has elapsed, or 5 years, or if you're older 10 or 20 or 30 years, simply bringing that act of goodness to mind makes you feel good. And this is why the Buddha called it an inner treasure. It means it's not something that can ever be stolen away from you. The recollection of the good and the kind deeds that you have performed in your life is a treasure in your heart. And simply bringing it to mind can dispel feelings of depression and despair in the mind. So this is a lesson I've learned, the power and the joy that we gain in our life through giving and sharing. And I'd like you to see whether that makes sense to you as well. And certainly if you're very motivated and very dedicated to your studies and your future career, and you need to balance that with thought of others to prevent yourself just becoming too narrow and in this bubble of your own dreams and desires. Another area of life is relationship between the body and the mind, as an object of study. So, what influence do your actions and your health have upon your mental states. So this begins with very basic things like whether or not you get enough rest, or whether you rest at the same time every day, every evening. Refers to your diet, refers to exercise. These are all physical activities that influence your mind and your mental states. And similarly, your mental states affect your physical health. We know that if you're very stressed out, it's very easy to fall ill. Your immune system is compromised by stress. So if that's the case, then we need to give some thought to how to take care of our bodies in such a way that they're not having a detrimental impact on our minds, and how to take care of our minds so as not to have a detrimental effect on our physical health. So the Buddhist teachings are, I think, most effectively summarized as an education system, a very complete and effective education system. And one of the points made here is that we have a capacity to learn from our experience, that it should be at the heart of making our way in the world. So here again, I would ask you to consider, when you look back on your life in the past, are you aware of any bad habit that you had in the past which you were able to overcome? Or at the very least is not so overpowering as it was in the past? If that's the case, then there's an important conclusion that we can make, that there's nothing fixed in our life. That if that particular bad habit would be reduced or overcome, why not other bad habits? Are there really positive qualities you see in yourself now that you couldn't see a few years ago? If there are, then again we can infer from that we have a capacity to change. We have a capacity to develop good qualities within ourselves. Again, the Buddhist teaching here is that we are changing all the time. There's nothing fixed within us at all. And the changes that take place are not random. They're not part of some divine plan. The changes that take place are due to causes and conditions. And the challenge here is that, do you have the capacity to study and recognize the causes and conditions that underlie positive change in your life? Do you have the discipline and the interest and the passion to apply yourself to those causes and conditions and to bring those positive changes into your life or not? So these kinds of development and evolution are dependent on a technology and develop on a systematic application of certain principles. They're not going to happen by themselves. They're not going to happen through prayer or through ceremonies of any kind. They have come about through understanding the nature of the body, the nature of the mind, and applying the necessary principles to train and discipline those natural phenomena. So I think that these days many people are very systematic about their life in the world, their studies and their career, and don't find it too difficult to be systematic and apply certain principles in various areas of life. But where we tend to be very unsystematic is our inner life. And to make real change occur within us, we have to develop this ability to look within, so the power of introspection can be increased and become more reliable through devoted and consistent application. So when we look within, we see certain things that we took for granted and seem very real, but the more you look at them, the more they fragment. They just become kind of fuzzy, and things that you thought were very real and very substantial, and suddenly they just seem very nebulous and insubstantial. Other things that formerly never really considered suddenly become very clear and very prominent. But this is one of the things that we observe by looking within. Now, to look within, one of the key factors here is mindfulness. And mindfulness means the ability to sustain attention. That means not forgetting what needs to be remembered in any situation. One of the abilities that you maybe heard about before, and that's the ability to be present to your experience, or to dwell in the present moment. But what does that really mean? And how practical is that? Now, an obvious objection to that would be, well, if you're just in the present moment, then how would you know how to deal with problems if all the problems that you've formerly encountered were in the past, and you're not allowed to think of the past and use your experience from the past to deal with the present moment constructively? Or if you're in the present moment, then how can you prepare yourself adequately for the future? The answer here is that dwelling in the present means that we understand the past as memory. And memory arises and passes away in the present moment. The future, right now, is thought. And we are aware of the arising and passing away of thought in the present moment. This is what being mindful means. It doesn't mean a rejection of the past, but it means understanding the past as the present experience of memory, and understanding the future as the present experience of thought. So we live with mindfulness of memory as memory, and the mindfulness of thought as thought, and that is dwelling in the present moment. But the problem is not thought or memory. The problem is being caught up in it and being dragged here and there by it without awareness. Meditation is there any value to it? What is it? This again, I would say, is something really worth considering. What is the relationship between mindfulness and inner peace, or we call samadhi? What's the relationship between mindfulness and wisdom? What is wisdom? What's the distinct? How do we define wisdom? What is it to be a wise person? But these, I think, are really interesting things to contemplate. And what tools do we need to investigate these kinds of topics? So with mindfulness, we are learning how to abandon all the junk in our mind. So if you were to sit down and think, what have you been thinking about all day? Okay, a certain amount, quite a lot, will be thinking about your school subjects, of course. But in free periods, how much of the thinking goes in your mind is conducive to your welfare and happiness? How much of it is useful to your life? How much of it is junk? And how much of it, rather than being conducive to your welfare and happiness, leads in the opposite direction, drags you down? What is anxiety? What is stress? What is depression? Without thinking. What is the role of thinking in these kinds of mental disorders and problems? So the Buddhist challenge is look within and not to accept any kind of philosophy or belief system, but develop tools to discover these truths for yourself, because that's when it becomes really meaningful. So what is the relationship between your thinking and sense experience? So we're constantly looking at things, listening to things. We're constantly bringing things into our mind. What kind of filter do you have on the stuff that you allow into your brain? Like filter water and filter things that come into our body to quite a remarkable degree. And yet we allow all kinds of junk into our brain and into our mind. And how can you expect that not to have any long-term effect? It accumulates in your brain. So, taking care of your eyes and your ears, what would that mean? How can you take care of your eyes in terms of choosing what kind of information you're allowing into your brain by way of your eyes? What kind of information are you allowing into your brain, into your mind through your ears, body? Is that something that you should be paying attention to? Now, with regards to thinking, how do we deal with thinking? Can we make a distinction between useful, beneficial thoughts and harmful thoughts? Can we find a way of restricting or abandoning the negative thoughts, promoting the positive thoughts? What about experiencing the mind without thinking at all? What would that be like? Is that something worth exploring? If you are someone who identifies with your thinking very much. You know, if you think you're a smart person and your pride in yourself is very much bound up with your intellect, then experiencing pure awareness without thinking is extremely liberating. It just leads to a completely reassessment, you know, of who you are. It's very exciting and wonderful thing to see. Yeah, I am not my thinking. My thinking is a tool, but it's not who I really am. So who am I really? Well, that's not necessarily a very good question to ask. But what we can ask is, what am I not? But the idea here is somewhat, it's maybe expressed well in the anecdote told of Michelangelo, who sculpted this huge rearing horse, extremely lifelike. And someone said, how on earth did you manage to sculpt something that seems so realistic and lifelike from a lump of rock? And he said, well, I just chipped away all the bits that weren't the horse, and the horse is what's left. So the idea of spiritual development is somewhat similar to this. Chip away all the bits that are not peace. But when people meditate, often they get very frustrated because they run into mental agitation and sensual thoughts and angry thoughts and depressed thoughts and anxiety and sleepiness and conclude that meditation is not for me. But meditation is a means of revealing the workings of the mind and all the ways in which we create confusion and suffering for ourselves unnecessarily. So when we meditate, we're learning. When you give your mind a job to do, a very simple task like keep your mind on the sensation of your breath as it comes in and out. What could be simpler than that? But because the breath is not an interesting object, it doesn't hold your attention naturally. It is a very good means of developing attention and applying attention and sustaining attention. Now you could watch a movie or some entertainment and be absolutely glued to the screen for 2 or 3 hours even, totally in the present moment, but there would be no spiritual benefit to it because there's no effort involved, because you're just drawn into the narrative and the emotions that are stimulated by the narrative. There's nothing coming from you. But the breath, for example, is such a popular object, one that meditation teachers have been teaching for 2,000 more years, because you can only be the breath through the breath because you know how to sustain attention, you know how to create the motivation to sustain attention, you know how to protect the mind from distraction, you know how to remove and bring the mind back to its focus when it loses its attention. So you are developing very important life skills, and you are developing a new way of looking at your mind. So before, if you've never meditated before, just generally you say, oh, today I'm very anxious, or today I feel a bit down, or a bit depressed, or today I feel really excited. And then there's this idea, there's this me, this kind of ghostly me, who goes through this kind of series of emotions, up and down, round and round. But when you give the mind a job, a focus, such as being aware of the breath. Now there's a totally new way. You're revolutionizing the way you're seeing that there is, agitation arises in the mind, it passes away. Or sleepiness or dullness arises and passes away. And now you're seeing these things as mental states that arise due to causes and conditions, are sustained through causes and conditions, and pass away through causes and conditions. And the idea that these are who I am no longer arises. You see, the less mindful you are, the more the sense of self is so strong. And you're not saying ego is bad, I shouldn't have an ego, but you're seeing that intensity of me and mine is not a constant in your experience. It fluctuates. And the more clarity of mind you have, the less it appears. And if you develop meditation to a higher level, that sense of being the owner of experience starts to dissolve altogether. So it's not to say there's no conventional self, but there's no assumption that is who I really am. So all kinds of very interesting and liberating perspectives arise when you turn attention within. And you begin to see how you create suffering for yourself and you don't need to. It's not a curse, it's not who you are. It's habits. You've developed bad habits of mind because you've never really considered the possibility of creating good habits of mind. There's a lot of confusion in the mind and incompatible beliefs and ideas dwelling together simply because you've never turned the light on. So this is just an idea of an area of life, the inner discovery, inner exploration, and how through that interest in exploring the inner world, in conjunction with one's efforts to lead a good and constructive life in the world, lead to an all-rounded development which can bring true peace and happiness to oneself and enhance our ability to create happiness and benefit to those around us. So that, there are books with like 12 lessons for life and this number of lessons for life. So this has been a real kind of scattergun kind of approach, not really sort of number one, number two, number three, but I would basically encouraging you to take an interest in your life, not just some particular areas of life, but this thing, this life, and don't be afraid or shrink back from the big questions. Well, I'm going to be here for 70, 80, maybe 90 years. What for? Ultimately, what's it all for? What's the best way I can live my life? How can I live my life in a way that I feel proud and fulfilled? What are the goals in life, and are they truly fulfilling? And taking an interest in these fundamental features of life, which no matter what career we pursue and where we live and who we live with, these what we call the worldly winds, gain and loss. You need to really study these, otherwise you'll get caught up with them and they'll be a cause of suffering. They bite you. Gain and loss. How do you feel when you make a gain? How do you feel when you make a loss? What's the wisest way to deal with all the gains in life and all the losses in life? Status, gains and status, loss of status, fame, renown. How are we going to deal with those things in our life? Praise and blame. Wherever you are, whether you're in the world or in a monastery, praise and blame, they're going to be a part of your life. Have you really thought through those things? To what extent are you motivated by desire for praise and fear of blame? To what extent does your craving for praise affect your fear of blame? Is it the case that the more you enjoy and bask in praise, the more painful you find it when you're not praised or when you're criticized? How does it feel when you're criticized for something that you're innocent of? And somebody blames you for something that you didn't do. Why does that feel so bad? Exactly why? And this is really something worth looking into. Pleasure and pain. Is it the case that the more we indulge in pleasure, the more sharply we feel the pain of its loss? What's the relationship between pain and suffering? Are they one and the same thing? One Buddhist teacher gave a formula for this you might like to consider. He said, pain multiplied by the resistance to pain equals suffering. So if you have a lot of pain and a lot of resistance to pain, then you suffer a lot. If you have a lot of pain and not so much resistance to pain, then you suffer less. Is that true? And the Buddhist hypothesis is that if you have pain, but you have zero resistance to pain, then pain multiplied by zero equals zero, zero suffering. Is that possible? Is it possible to experience physical pain without suffering? If pain and suffering were the same thing, then the same pain would always give rise to the same amount of suffering. But is that the case? So these are areas of life, encourage you to think about, because it's so easy to get into this, the whole rhythm of academic study, and you sort of like, well, put off those kind of things for the time being, when I have more time. But there's sometimes people sort of wake up, they're 40 years old before they suddenly realize, where did all the time go? So I speak from my own experience. When I was at school and I had these kinds of interests and concerns. What's a good way to live life? What's the best way to live life as a human being? Why is there so much suffering? Does it have to be like this? Could the world be any better than this? If it could, what's your responsibility as a human being to contribute towards the betterment of the world? These were questions that really occupied me a lot in my teens. And I couldn't find anybody who really encouraged me to think about these things. So look, we just don't have enough time. We're studying for O-levels. So, well, then I would say, well, what for? Oh, here he goes again. So, because if we don't get O-levels, well, we can't study A-levels. I said, well, what do you want to study A-levels for? Well, if you don't study A-levels, you can't get into university. And so, well, what do you want to go to university for? And, by this time, everybody's totally irritated with these kinds of questions. Oh, shut up, just... But for me, I thought, well, if I don't think about these things now, I'm just afraid it's going to be too late. So suggest, look into these things, find time. What's it all really for? What kind of human being do you want to be? What kind of life do you want? And the kind of life that you want, or you're respite, it's not going to happen by itself. It's going to depend upon the causes, the conditions that you create, the choices that you make. And before I began this talk, I wrote on the rugby ball. Maybe some of you think, what did he write on the rugby ball? So I wrote on the rugby ball, with mindfulness, we have many options. Without it, we have few. So the kind of questions that I'm suggesting you look into, your ability to look into them is conditioned by mindfulness, the ability to put aside all the confusion and the worries and the doubts. Not to blast it away and force it out of your mind, you can't do that. Not to get caught up with it, but to see thought as thought, memory as memory, anxiety as anxiety, see mental states for what they are, create some space within your mind, and then allow yourself to dwell on some of these big issues of your life. So I would like to end my talk.